Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another lecture on brain, mind and education. I apologise for the delay. This time it was caused by me realising that Blackboard is about to go down all afternoon, so I needed to download the slides that we're going to need for the workshop. And there is a workshop today at 2 o'clock in room 406 to talk about the poster. It's not mandatory, but you're very welcome to attend. I think we can just about get everybody in there if you want to come along, but you don't have to come along. The slides from that discussion are going to be on Blackboard. In fact, they already are on Blackboard. That's what I was just downloading. As long as I remember to put them on a memory stick and take them up to 406, because I will not be able to access them up there. Okay, so please remind me about that before I log off. So today we're going to be doing language reading and dyslexia. And last week we were talking about number. And perhaps it seems a little bit strange that in terms of talking about those basic fundamental skills you need for school, for education, to get along in human culture, we began with number rather than reading, maybe. But the current thinking on how we develop these skills, and we didn't evolve to read, we didn't evolve to do maths, but these things came along as a result, to a large extent, of our cultural developments in terms of using symbols. And the current thinking is that, in fact, the maths came before the literacy. So the first symbols that we see in written form are actually demonstrating quantity rather than somebody's diary or what happened yesterday or anything like that. And you can sort of see how easily that could come about because trade has always been incredibly important. Sometime after, or a long time after speech had developed, a long time after trade had become important, people started realizing that to keep a track on their trading exploits and to work out how much they were passing over or receiving, it was quite useful to be able to make marks. And one step on from that was making marks next to something that represented what they were trading. And then, of course, you have a word. And then, of course, once you have some words in written form, you can start developing more complex constructs in terms of sentences. And one of the reasons that we think this occurred is because there's evidence of some of our first cultures, our first urban civilizations that existed without written language, but with trading. And in fact, in Corral in Peru, where they've been unearthing the first city in the Americas, we see evidence of them using the quipu, which was being used by the Incas actually 500 or 600 years ago, still, we think, as a means of, like a sort of abacus or a way of keeping count. It's made of string. And we see one of these quipus actually engraved in the stone in the ancient city in Corral, which is about 5,000 or 6,000 years old, and the first city in the Americas. But we don't see any evidence of written language. So we find evidence of number before we find evidence of what you might call writing. And we've already seen last week that, in fact, there are things that we share with other animals, these very early abilities to be able to approximate. And so those skills, should I use the word innate? I don't really want to use the word innate because innate is such a very special word. We've dealt with how special that word is when we were talking about development. But certainly we have more of a preparedness perhaps to make judgments about number than we do about writing. Okay, so let's move on then to writing, having evolved some simple ideas about language and started about number and started representing number as symbols. Let's get rid of that. Oh, I'm not going to get rid of it now. Oh, stay. Okay. So we're going to look at spoken language first of all, because that, again, was the thing which we developed first, a long time before written language. Then we will look at written language, studies of normal reading processes. Actually, there are surprisingly few neuroimaging studies of normal reading processes. Why do you think that might be? By the way, the lecture is being broadcast, so anything you say will be broadcast as well. There's no camera on you, so we'll never know. Yes? They're not very interesting. People aren't bothered about it. They want to see the strange stuff. They want to see the strange stuff. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're sort of right. There are a lot of studies of abnormal reading. I mean, it seems to be some sort of historical aspect to this, in the sense that one of the main motivations for doing some of the first neuroscience studies, and in fact, one of the first sources of neuroscience information was from the damaged brain. There were a lot of studies about neuroscience of those type coming out of Italy up until about 10 or 15 years ago. I think that has greatly diminished now. Does anybody know why we now have much fewer studies coming out of Italy in terms of abnormal brains? Yes.
Well, because in Italy we don't receive any more funding for research. It's one of the biggest issues we have right now.
No, it's actually because of the introduction of the crash helmet. So these neuroscience studies were really about people who'd lost, as a result of trauma on one side of the brain, being able to still have a lot of language faculties, but as soon as damage to the left side of the brain, you see a much greater impact on language. So those first neuroscience studies were really about comparing people with trauma in different parts of the brain. So the abnormal brain suddenly became very, very important. It's also true that it's still true that actually you can often get better, or you can get ethical clearance easier for children with developmental disorders than you can for children with let's say healthy brains. And all of that history has sort of caused a skew towards there being a lot of imaging studies of children with ADHD, children with dyslexia, children with dyscalculia. But of course, to make those meaningful, we really do need to compare them with healthy brains. And we see very fewer studies of that. We also see fewer studies of children per se. We have many more studies of adults. So that's something else to bear in mind. So when you're looking for studies in the literature of healthy children's development in terms of neuroimaging studies, you'll be surprised, you've just got a handful really. Anyway, we'll be then moving on to brain differences in atypical readers. And then what may cause dyslexia, which is very, very debatable. Okay, so the brain basis of spoken language. First of all, is spoken language innate? There are some people who will tell you that it is, some people will tell you that it won't. We have these ideas coming from people such as Chomsky and Steven Pinker that there is some evolutionary instinct here towards language. It depends how you interpret evolutionary instinct. We certainly have an instinct towards socialization. I would argue that it's probably innate because we are primates first and foremost. And then there is this idea of, the idea that experience specializes us in some way. So we're not born with, and no one's really claiming that we're born, let's say English people are born with an innate ability to speak English. This is not the case, but we do have areas of the brain that tend to become domain specific to a particular language, or let's say to a particular faculty such as learning language. But it's the experience that actually specializes us and helps us become expert Chinese, English speakers or whatever. Having said that, although the experience is what specializes us, we can actually see some of these very early language abilities. So for example, this study here that was done in 2006 scanned 3-month-old babies while they were listening to speech. So they weren't producing speech, but they were just listening to it. And it is becoming easier to scan very young children's brains in those sorts of tasks. And what we see is left hemisphere activation in some parts of the left hemisphere that are specific to language activating. So are we saying that those parts of the brain are language dedicated? We're talking about areas of cortex that we'll have a look at in a minute. Are they language dedicated? If we see babies activating those parts of the brain when they hear speech, can we say that those are language specific areas? I'm really trying to encourage you these days to think critically about these ideas. It's like the next phase of the unit in a way, is to start thinking, well, okay, you know, I know about the cortex, I know about the proto-cortex idea, nature interacting with nurture, all these sorts of things. So when I hear a bit of evidence like that, perhaps it's extremely easy for me to say, well, look, there, it must be innate. I mean, you know, here are these children, they're only 3 months old, and they're already activating those parts of the brain that adults activate when they learn a language, and they haven't even learnt the language yet. What can they know at 3 months? So are we saying those parts of the brain, therefore, must be language specific?
Not really, because they are damages and the languages can be the same.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, if that part gets damaged, another part will probably take over, actually, in terms of developing the language. And also, we don't know that those parts of the brain may be activating in respect of other types of stimuli that are not language as well. So there also we have to start generating these arguments, and you have to start becoming people who can say, oh yeah, that's very interesting, but you know, it's not necessarily conclusive. Okay, so yeah, so they saw language in Broca's area, superior temporal regions similar to language areas in adults. Well, we're going to be talking a lot more about that in a minute, those regions such as Broca's and Wernicke's area. Babies come into the world actually able to distinguish between all speech sounds. But some of this ability, and this is fascinating, Patricia Kuhl found in her study in '92, and she's done more work on this since, that some of this ability is lost by 6 months. The child can only distinguish sounds that he or she has been exposed to. So, for example, because I hadn't heard Russian sounds before the age of 6 months, my parents didn't speak Russian, I was never taken anywhere in Russia. When I wanted to learn Russian, when I was about 28, I had to sit there for hours listening to the difference between a t and a t. Actually, I don't think I can tell the difference myself now, but it's all about where you put the tip of the tongue in the mouth, how far forward it is. And I was constantly saying to my teacher, there is no difference between that. Can you just do that again? It took me a very long time to tell the difference between those sounds, because I hadn't heard them when I was a little newborn baby. But so what we're looking at here is some sort of sensitive period that appears to be closing. It doesn't mean it's sensitive, though. It's not critical. We don't tend to use the word critical period. Critical tends to suggest that once that period is gone, it's completely impossible to learn. Instead, we use the word sensitive, which means it's more difficult once you've got past that period, but you can do it. And I did do it in the end. So the brain does not seem to treat the differences as significant, and behaviourally we don't experience the differences. So there does seem to be this sensitive language window if we haven't heard the language before that age. Okay, so we're going to move on to some important regions of the brain. We've decided now that, you know, there is some preparedness for language. There is a sense in which the brain has particular times when it's more sensitive than others to language. It's not innate in the sense that we're not specialized to learn Chinese or English, but it is innate in the sense that we have at least an instinct towards socialization. How much further you want to go than that in terms of its innateness? Well, you know, there's a huge argument just over the hill if you want to get involved with that. So the two regions we might as well start off with in the brain that are really important for language are Broca's and Wernicke's. We've known for a long time that spoken language appears to be handled by the left hemisphere of the brain in most people. So if you are right-handed, I think there's only like a few % chance that you could possibly have most of your language regions in the right side of the brain. I think it's something like, I can't remember what it is, 2 or 3% chance. If you're left-handed, there's something like a 1 in 3 possibility that in fact your language areas are on the other side of the brain, on the right side. So we have to say, in most people, it's left lateralized. That doesn't mean, by the way, that in many, many language tasks, you're going to be using all parts of the brain. So when you make up a creative story, and in fact, when you're talking about anything, those concepts in the language that you're talking about, such as please close the door, the word door is probably going to activate, just the word door is going to activate all sorts of regions in the brain in terms of memories and associations and pre-motor planning to open it and all sorts of issues. So, don't get into the idea that if you chopped the right hand side of the brain off, that you would still be able to use your language effectively, as effectively. So Paul Broca, a 19th century neuroanatomist, first linked speech difficulties to damage to the inferior frontal gyrus. So this comes back to your motorcyclists, really, probably not in that century, but people who had damage to Broca's area, left inferior frontal gyrus. Oh, here we go now, gyrus. It's the ridge, isn't it? Left frontal, be somewhere around here. Okay. And that became known as Broca's area. So damage to this area, though, is quite the type of behavioural difference you get is quite different to other areas. Damage to that area causes disfluent speech. So they know what they're trying to say. There is some semblance. There is a sense in which they are trying to articulate the correct word. This is not a meaning issue. But in fact, the way in which it comes out, instead of saying door, they say duh, like that. So you can tell that they know the word they want to say, but it just doesn't seem to come out right. Okay, so that's Broca's area. Here we go, my rotating brains again. I do think these are quite, I know they're terribly distracting, but I do like them because at least they do let you see behind, and you can see that in fact it does, the primary motor cortex does actually extend down medially as well. So that's just the left hemisphere we're looking at here. So why have I got the primary motor cortex up? Because we're talking about a speech region, aren't we? This is Broca's area here. And the reason why I've got the primary motor cortex up, which is actually running along here, is to show you how close it is to the motor cortex. Now, when two regions are together in the brain, there's usually a good reason for that. It makes design sense, if you think about it, that if there are two regions that are going to have to work together quite closely, they should be very well connected. So you might as well have them together. And if we look at the primary motor cortex, Brodmann's area 4, going up here, and there we have it here, we'll see that every part of that primary motor cortex is actually related to a different part of the body. And what's quite interesting is that there is a topographical, there's maintenance of some topographical order here, because the eye is close to the nose in its organization on the motor cortex. And in fact, the eye is close to the nose in the body. The hand is next to, so the thing for moving the whole hand is next to the little finger, and all the little fingers are actually they are actually pretty much in order. They are in order in the motor cortex. So just to make clear, this is a section. This is basically this section. So if we took this red part out and then we sliced it down, then you'd be able to see going up the cortex like that, the order in which different parts of the brain are connected to the different parts of the body. And not only this, but the number of connections has also been graphed on here. So the size of the drawing is proportional to the density of the connections as well. So you can see there's loads of connections going to the hand, and there's this tongue here is particularly well connected. Things which are less important, perhaps, I don't know, like your toe, much smaller in terms of the number of cortical connections. Yes.
If someone was born without arms or something,
yeah,
does that affect
the
structure?
Yeah, it does. It does. Well, actually, there's some very interesting studies that have been done by Ramachandran, which the phantom limb experiments. So I have to try to explain this, but essentially, if you lose a limb, quite strangely, you feel that it's still there, and in fact, that's not necessarily a problem. But also, people who lose limbs tend to quite often get terrible cramps and pains after some time. And I think Ramachandran found out that part of that is because the brain still thinks it's got a limb. And if you use some mirrors, and it literally is mirrors, so that you say to the person, okay, lift your arms up and down, lift your arms up and down, because they're only lifting one arm, but in the mirror it looks like they're lifting a right arm as well, then you can fool the brain into thinking that you are actually exercising your lost arm, and that can actually reduce the cramps that you get as a result of not exercising your right arm, because those cramps, those pains are actually created by the brain. They're not actually created by not moving your arm. So even though you haven't got an arm anymore, you still get the cramps. So you just have to fool the brain into thinking that in fact you are doing your exercise. That wasn't really anything to do with the question, but it's really fascinating. But the other thing that he found was that there is a compensation that goes on, and after a while, that's right. Yeah, you find out after a while that you can start having issues with your shoulder, even though you still got your shoulder and your shoulder is working well, and it's because the brain is actually rewiring itself, and so those connections that were losing, had nowhere to go, are now reconnecting themselves to the connections that are next to them. So the thing that was controlling the arm is now controlling the shoulder. So the shoulder starts getting involved as well. And this is all really about the plastic cortex and the fact that things are not fixed and that they respond to experience. And understanding that can give you an insight into these really strange phenomena that you get with phantom limbs. Okay, did that sort of argue it?
Yeah.
Sort of answered, okay. Okay, so what we see is that Broca's area, amazingly, or maybe not amazingly, is incredibly close to the tongue and the mouth, the motor cortex that's controlling that, which kind of makes sense. Yeah. So this is about storing articulation codes, the instructions that you need to be able to produce particular formations with the tongue and the teeth, and therefore it makes sense that it's close to the parts of the brain that actually send those signals out to the muscles involved. A little while later, German neurologist Karl Wernicke studied brain damaged patients, here we go again, falling off their motorbike or the equivalent, who could speak, they can articulate, but they don't understand language. And quite often when they do speak, the things they say don't make sense. So they're saying, beswettel spottel moelbul bagel bing. In other words, they've got very good range of phonetic diversity. They can produce a good range of different phonemes, a good range of different sounds. They can put them together in a very precise way. They don't make no sense whatsoever. So this is a different type of speech problem. This is about meaning of speech rather than the actual articulation of it. So damage to a posterior region called Wernicke's area, the left superior temporal gyrus, back here, remember we've already had the superior temporal gyrus in a previous slide, can result in fluent language, very fluent, sounds, in terms of its articulation, very fluent, but no meaning. And what we find is that Wernicke's cortex, Wernicke's region is actually quite close to the auditory cortex. So this is the auditory cortex here, and Wernicke's region is around here. And that makes sense as well, because you need to be able to, meaning should be very closely related to the auditory signals that you receive. So when you hear ball, you don't have to think too hard to be able to see a sphere, a bouncy rubber sphere. Okay, so the meaning, the semantics, need to be closely related to the auditory codes, because the auditory codes, of course, are things that come first in language development, not reading. Now, in actual fact, modern imaging techniques show that it's a bit more complicated than this. So now I'm opening things up a little bit, and we're catching up with the present day. But we still see Broca's area and Wernicke's area in there with the regions that have been identified as being important for speech. So we tend to talk about the inferior frontal gyrus, the left inferior frontal gyrus, quite a bit broader region, but intersecting with what we were talking about as Broca's region, storing the articulatory speech codes. Now, one of the things I probably should do for this lecture at some point is have a whole list of the different words that we are using in language, because language learning is such a specialist area that it has its own language, if you like. So when I say articulatory. I'm talking about the way in which you need to move the jaw, the tongue, the teeth in order to be able to make a speech sound. Because when you think about it, I mean, let's do this now. Speech can be represented, has to be represented in the brain in many different ways, doesn't it? Okay, I mean, first of all, we've got it represented in the air in terms of vibrations. Yeah, so we have to, it has to be coded in an auditory way. You hear a sound and you say, okay, that's the word ball. Yeah. But also, if you were deaf and you could see very clearly that the way in which somebody is articulating something, or in fact, you could just give them instructions as to how to move the mouth, then you would also recognize that as the word ball. So speech also has to be coded. It has to be possible to code it in terms of the articulation of the mouth. Yeah. Can anybody tell me another way in which speech can be coded? Another way the brain has to be able to decode speech. We haven't come onto it yet, but we will soon. Okay, reading. Yeah, orthography. Orthography is the posh word for spelling, essentially. Okay, so, and the way in which things are written down. So it also has to be coded orthographically, but also language has to have meaning. So it has to be, there has to be a semantic coding. I have to be able to put the word ball together with the, oh, here I go. Always jump into an example and think, where am I going with this? The word ball has to be related to bat somehow. Okay, so ball and bat have to have a connection. And snowball, for example, snowball. I have to have this idea. It has to be coded conceptually as well in terms of the semantics. I have to know roughly what a ball means in a generic sense. Not just one ball, but all balls. They tend to be spherical, don't they? So if somebody says snowball, I can immediately think, okay, white, round, cold thing. Yeah. And also when we think about language in terms of reading and we think about it in terms of articulation, orthography and articulation, we can break it down further into individual units. So in speech, we can break down that sound into phonemes. Yeah. And there's an awful lot of arguments about when a phoneme starts and ends, but you know, it's a useful thing to do, and it seems that the brain can do that as well. It has to be able to do that. In fact, it's the basis of the phonics method of teaching reading now. We'll see some evidence for that in a minute. Okay, so if you have any trouble with these words, can you please put your hand up and say, what are you talking about? Because you're not expected to know what these mean, okay? So don't feel silly about it. Everybody else is sitting there wondering the same thing unless they're a language specialist. Okay, so here we are storing our articulatory speech codes. Back here, we have got the black region here, Wernicke's region. We tend to talk about that as parietal temporal regions, auditory motor mapping, the relationship between what we hear and what we actually do. So if I hear ball, I know that somebody is moving their mouth and tongue in a particular way. Think of the word ball, you know, then I can do that as well. Down here, though, in the middle temporal gyrus, we see activations to do with meaning, okay, and also lexical activation in terms of the whole word. All right, so lexicon usually means like a sort of, I always think of a dictionary whenever people say lexicon. Okay, so it's like this is if you have a word dictionary, it's somewhere around about there, if you like. But it's also about that it's got the meaning in that dictionary as well. Identifying a word and its meaning, and then of course we have this region. This is the third time I've mentioned it. The superior temporal gyrus, acoustic phonetic mapping. So if you hear the word T coming through, then you can. Sorry, if you hear the word T coming through, then you hear it as a phoneme T. Okay. Right. So let's have a look finally at some studies of normal readers. And until recently, well, I said recently, but I suppose it's about 8 years now. but we still haven't got that much brain data on normal reading acquisition processes. But it is becoming more possible using fMRI techniques and also EEG. So this was one of the first ones, and it still gets referenced very many times. So I think it's a good thing to cover it. The Turkeltaub study in 2003, over 10 years old, probably the first study that ever really looked at this seriously. But it's quite nice because it joins up with some of the history. Oh, here's a few more. Here we are. Grapheme. I forgot to mention that one as well. So just as you can break up the sound of a word into phonemes, so you can break up the orthography of a word, the spelling of a word, into graphemes. That's a unit of written language. Yeah. The alphabet is one example of that, but you know, to some extent, some people will argue that maybe, you know, you could treat the subunits, that's too small a subunit. You could actually you need larger subunits, maybe of 2 letters as well. The orthography is the spelling. The phoneme is the unit of spoken language. Lexicon, whole set or a list of units. So sometimes people talk about a phonological lexicon. So that would be like a phonological dictionary. So you actually look it up and you look at the way in which the spelling is mapped to the sound that you hear. Okay. So one of the dominant models that we had from psychology was the dual root model of reading words. This was very influential and I suppose it still does remain quite influential. And in a way, it corresponds to some of the arguments that we're still getting about reading. So it's worth covering. So here we've got these 2 roots. We hear speech coming through the air, and the brain tries to sort out what it means. Well, there's one way in which you can do that very quickly. You can actually go quite directly. You can go to your dictionary. You can decode it very quickly, that maybe even the whole word, and you can look it up in your phonological lexicon, and you can your semantics, the meaning of it, the context can contribute to that. But essentially, you are making a much more direct mapping of what you're hearing to the actual meaning. Yeah, so it's going to require more of a memory, if you like, but a memory for that very specific word. So you're not actually decoding the word b, a, l, and then looking it up. You just hear the word ball as a whole. I mean, you look it up in your lexicon, you're thinking about the meaning, and you've got your phonological lexicon there as well, so you can possibly sometime afterwards translate it into its separate phonemes, but essentially you're doing it very directly. Another way of doing it is just to go straight to the grapheme phoneme, and you know, if you're reading it, then you can see that it's made up of these letters, and you can translate those letters into sounds, and then you can just speak those sounds all together. But that's actually going to take a lot longer, because you're having to decode each segment at a time and then put it together. So this is referred to as the more indirect phonologically mediated access, whereas this model of reading is much more direct. And it should be faster as a result of that. But the problem with this is that phonological processing actually appears very, very rapid. And you can see this in studies of parafoveal preview. Parafoveal preview is what happens when you're actually able to scan information which is not exactly where you are looking. It's not actually direct center of your attention. So it's not exactly peripheral. It's not like it's over there, but you're looking a little bit further away from the center and able not just to look at the word that you're supposed to be reading, but you're actually having a little peek at the word that's in front. And these studies of parafoveal preview, in which attention is momentarily shifted to something further on, we can actually see in these studies that phonological information is being scanned in the next word as you're reading out the word that's in front of you. So this tends to imply that this is really a very fast method of phonological decoding. And we also see that it's true for skilled readers. Because if you think about it, if you go back to this dual root model, you know, because this is so much faster, if you're becoming very, very skilled, and we know that as you become more skilled, you get much faster, there's an assumption that you're going to be doing this much less, and you're going to be doing this, this much more and this much less, yeah? Because as you get faster, you're going to be able to make these associations very quickly, and you're not going to have to decode all the time. So we expect the more skilled readers to be able to, to ignore the phonological decoding more and more, because it's just so time consuming. But we don't see that. And in these studies of parafoveal preview with these skilled readers, it becomes very clear that skilled readers are actually skilled because they're very good at doing this phonological decoding. They're not leaving the phonological decoding behind. They're actually getting incredibly good at doing it. So what I would try to sell you is this study, is this idea that's in Ashby. There's a reference down here to it, Ashby 2012, which is a more up-to-date, I would say, way of thinking about reading. Let me go back to that, in which we've actually got phonological processing, orthographic processing, and the semantics, the context in which you're thinking about it and the meaning of the words, actually all happening at once. Because the brain is a parallel processing machine, it's capable of doing that. So it seems unlikely, frankly, that you would end up in a massively interconnected machine like the brain. It's extremely unlikely that you would end up with anything that looks like flowcharts and arrows and boxes, because it is possible to have connections between all these, bidirectional connections, and that can increase the efficiency and make the brain do things that this sort of clunky serial approach could never do. It seems extremely unlikely that you don't have that parallel processing going on. So it becomes more reasonable to think about reading as an interaction that's happening very quickly between phonological processing, the sound, the orthographic processing, what you're actually seeing on the page, the spelling of it and the writing, and the semantics in terms of the meaning and the context. And all those things are interacting very quickly. We can map those areas. Yes? Yes, yeah, so you fill in the gaps. So I'm being asked, is that anything to do with your ability to fill in the gaps when you're reading? And yeah, I mean, that type of very rapid, yeah. So yeah, so I think I'm not sure if we've dealt with this yet, but it's in cognition and learning. I'll be mentioning this idea. Yes, I think we have, about graceful degradation. We have mentioned it. This idea that in parallel processing networks, if you take a part out, it doesn't actually cause the whole thing to crash, And similarly, if you give your processing system insufficient information, then you can usually quite rapidly get over it and make adjustments and get on without it. And the serial method, that's going to cause all sorts of problems, because you're still waiting to get your information sorted out before you go on to the next stage. But in this parallel approach, then you've got redundancy built in. You've got processing redundancy, which means that if you've got inadequate information, it's easier to allocate new resources to be able to solve this now more tricky problem. Yeah. That's right. So you might not even notice it because it's so automatic. It becomes so automatic. Yeah, that sort of compensation. So the Ashby model, is very similar, really, and I've put it on top here of the regions that I identified previously. So you can see that it's not a radically different message that I'm giving you. These regions are still associated with orthographic, phonological, semantic processing in these different ways, but we see this interconnectivity. And we're not claiming that it starts off here and then goes to there or whatever. There's actually interactions going on all the time. A good example of that, for example, is when we ask children to identify rhymes. The ability, if you see, there's this issue about if you see two words rhyming, two words with similar spelling, then you expect them to rhyme. And if they You know, if they're not rhyming, then it indicates some sort of issue is arising. But so your ability to rhyme actually can influence your ability to spell, and your ability to spell can influence your ability to rhyme. And really, those things, you know, you wouldn't think were particularly connected, but they are. And that sort of data all suggests that there is this massive interconnectivity between the different ways in which we code speech. Okay, so we can move on to studies of the normal reading process. This procedure controls the brain processes not specific to decoding processes. Oh, hang on, we've skipped something out here. Have I missed a slide? Oh, I have, thank goodness for that. Okay, so we're moving on to normal reading processes, and this Turkletout study, they looked at individuals from 6 to 22 years old, and they had this very clever task where they were asking people to carry out actually feature detection. They weren't saying read these words, they were actually asking them to say whether it, for example, it had an ascender, some tall letter, or not. Okay, so an ascender would be an L here, so that's got an ascender. And they asked them to look at real words, and they asked them to look at nonsense symbols. So both of these have got ascenders. There's an ascender there, and there's an ascender there. This one's a real word, that one's nonsense. The important thing about this approach is that it encourages people to use their natural reading strategy. They're not thinking, oh, I've got to read these words. Okay, well, I will decode it phonetically. We're actually finding out what they really do when they automatically read, because reading is an automatic process. And if you're learning to read, you will have already started to identify these words as having meaning, and you will not be able to stop yourself from reading. So that's why they use these feature detection tasks rather than asking people to read the words. So that controls for brain processes that are not specific to the decoding process, e.g. spatial processing, motor planning. So you still have to do some of the things to both the nonsense words and the real words, which are not really what we're interested in. So by comparing the activity in the brain between the nonsense words and the real words, we can see some true measure of the brain activity for reading. Okay, so the regions that we see activated are left posterior temporal cortex. This is actually the Ashby diagram, and you can see that these are the sorts of regions that were on the previous diagram. Left inferior frontal cortex there, right inferior parietal cortex, interestingly on the other side, okay? So it's not always just left hemisphere. They also measured the reading ability, and they also measured their phonological skills. At some point, yeah, I wanted to give these out actually. So could you pass those back? Did you go to did I ask you to go to 108? Could you just pick up some, there's some more of these in 108, which is the master's office. Yeah, just come out. I think we might run out. So here, because I can't really show these very well on the PowerPoint slide, just take one and pass them back. If we run out, my friend has just gone to get some more. Actually, it's good to give these out, but I don't think I need them for this particular slide. So whilst those are going out, I can carry on talking. So the findings indicate the temporoparietal cortex activity, including the left superior temporal sulcus, Wernicke's area, we've already talked about, matures quite early, and it continues to be involved in reading throughout adulthood. So this is a region which very early on starts to activate. The superior temporal sulcus, which is just under the gyrus, is implicated in cross-modal integration, e.g. mapping print to sound. Have we all got enough of those? Because some more have come in. Oh, could you pass them? Yeah, could you pass those back? I thought we might have a couple missing at the back. Thank you ever so much. And what we find is, what was found was that the superior temporal sulcus appeared to be correlated with those phonological awareness skills. So this may be an indicator of how well the children are learning to read, activity in that area. Now, what I've done here is actually to redraw the graphs that you'll find in the paper. So if you go to the paper, you will find graphs like this, but a lot more complicated. But this basically gives you the message in those graphs in that paper. This is activity in the left-hand side of the brain in two regions. One of them is the left temporal language area, or sometimes referred to as the visual word form area, going back to the angular gyrus, posterior temporal, yeah? We call it the visual word form area actually, but that VWFA, often referred to, but actually we weren't evolved to read, and actually that part of the brain can process a lot of other things visually other than just words. But it became known historically about 20 years ago as the VWFA. So you will come across that. And what we see there is the activity increasing with age in that region as they become more and more proficient readers. Another left hemisphere region linked to reading phonological skills. I haven't said which it is, but it's likely to, let's have a look, hang on. It's going to be this region here, Broca's region, near Broca's region anyway. So a region near Broca's region here is also in the left hemisphere, and it's increasing its activity. Yeah, so we have two regions in the left hemisphere, very much associated with language, that are increasing their activity as you learn to read. But what's really interesting is that we have two regions in the right hemisphere, contralateral to the left temporal language area, so on the other side to this one, almost symmetrically, that is decreasing its activity as the children learn to read. And another region here, posterior fusiform gyrus, which is also related to visual processing, just like the visual word form area, decreasing its activity as the children get older and they become more proficient readers. So the message appears to be that as you learn to read, there is a shift in brain activity from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere amongst normal readers. And in fact, what they found was that shift, I'm not sure if it's this study, in another study, that you can actually see that shift occurs less effectively amongst readers who are dyslexic. So there is a problem in becoming lateralized, in language becoming lateralized to the left hemisphere. These right-hand areas appear to be related to visual processing. So what appears to be the case is that if you are having trouble reading, you rely much more on visual processing and visual processing strategies to get you through. So you're not decoding it phonologically, but you're going on that more direct route and actually just identifying it visually and remembering what that's supposed to be, rather than saying, oh, it's b, a, l, l, in terms of that phonological coding using left hemisphere. You're just remembering that that shape of the whole thing is actually means ball. And this kind of links in this sort of shift from right visual cortex areas towards the left hemisphere language areas is quite supportive of some long-standing models of reading in which children are assumed to go from logographic to alphabetic to orthographic stages, so that they become more and more proficient and, you know, rely at phoneme grapheme processing and rely less and less on the visual features of the letters and the words. And this is quite weird because actually, if you go back to 1925, it was the American neurologist Samuel Orton who, and we don't really know how he managed to reach this conclusion because he really did not have the data to make such a speculation. But he actually speculated that learning to read, when there were problems, it was about disengagement of the right hemisphere. He suggested that children who have difficulty learning to read actually have problems disengaging the right hemisphere and learning to use their left hemisphere. Well, that's a very hand-waving way of saying it, but it does appear, you know, in general terms, that he was correct. Now, it's worth pointing out that there's huge cultural effects on learning to read. Different languages engage brain areas differently depending on the regularity of the orthography. So English is a very irregular language in the sense that we have words like yacht that when you look at them don't give you really any clues as to how you should pronounce it. Whereas when you go to Italian, that's much more regular, and you find, you know, that dyslexia, which is linked to issues with this phonological decoding, you know, there are studies that show it can be less prevalent in these countries where they have more regular orthography, or more regular orthographic phonological mapping would be the way to say it. It's that relationship between what you see on the page and the sounds that need to be made. Regular languages, we find when we put people in scanners, rely more on the middle parts of the brain, while irregular languages use area at the back of the brain to a greater extent. Why do you think that is? So you should be tooled up to be able to answer this question now. So, you know, we're putting people with Italian and they're reading, and we compare those to the English people, and what we find is that the English people reading English are activating this part of the brain much more at the back. Occipital lobe, visual memory. There's no way in which you can work it out phonologically. It wouldn't make sense. You just have to remember that yacht is pronounced yacht. So we find, you know, big cultural influences on the neural correlates of reading, and you can expect those to play out in the way in which reading develops amongst children in different cultural contexts as well. So I've already started mentioning this idea that problems with reading, let's say dyslexia, to use the broad term, are actually related to phonological decoding. But, you know, this is a very contentious area of research, and you have to bear this in mind. There are many conflicting theories, and people have invested their lives and their reputations on backing these theories, and you know, my sense is that in a way that I think it has become the case that there have been periods where opinions have been so entrenched that it's been quite difficult for actually to get all the findings together and actually make progress in this area. So yeah, autumn 1925, it's been going on that long and the arguments still rage. What do we see amongst atypical readers in terms of the differences in the way in which their brain activates? Well, brain differences have been found in a wide variety of areas. Activity in the left language areas appear to be reduced, and as I said before, activity in the right hemisphere appears to be increased relative to normal readers, because there seems to be this lack of shifting to the left hemisphere amongst dyslexic readers. Reduced activity in the left insular region, that's thought to be a bridge between the different language processing areas. It's like sort of a node of communication. Left planum temporale, that's the superior temporal gyrus, is larger. Maybe it's larger because it's having to work harder, we're not sure. Differences in the corpus callosum, so people have said, okay, maybe that's related to the left and the right hemispheres communicating differently in dyslexics, and that could well be the case because they're processing language differently in terms of the two hemispheres, so there has to be differences in communication between the two hemispheres, but that could be an outcome of those strategies that they're using. It may not be a cause. Reduced activation in the cerebellum, well, why would that be important? We used to think the cerebellum was just about movement and balance, and that's why dogs have big cerebellums, but we're thinking of it more in terms of timing differences now, and timing is very important to speech. If I mess about with the timings of the different phonemes that you're producing, you would very quickly sound inarticulate. So timing may be an issue. We'll look at that in a minute. Magnocellular system deficits. There are particular nerve cells which control visual attention and eye movements, and this, you know, these are responsible for timing the way in which your eyes move across the page when you're reading the words. And it has been suggested that there are problems in the visual magnocellular system, that can influence the way in which you're looking at the words on the page, and that can cause problems with reading. We'll look at that, again in a minute, because all of these ideas sound very interesting, and of course you're probably sitting there thinking, oh yes, if you have trouble reading, or somebody who has trouble reading, you're probably thinking, oh yes, no, that sounds just like this person, or it sounds just like that person. But actually, we have to think about it more scientifically than that. What would be the outcomes of having a problem in the visual system? What would be the outcomes, not just in terms of reading, but in terms of other behaviors as well? What would be the outcomes if we had problem with just phonological decoding? What would be the outcomes if we had problems with timing? Because remember, if you've got a cerebellum timing problem, it might not just be for language, it might be in terms of other types of behavior as well. So we have to start thinking critically about some of the ideas that you're going to encounter in the literature when you decide, oh, I'm going to do language, I'm going to do reading, second language, dyslexia. These are all things which are interesting to me. And you're going to come across some views and opinions, and you have to look at them critically and say, well, okay, maybe that's a cause. And actually, as soon as you write cause, there should be hundreds of alarm bells going off in your head now. In fact, I would try not to use the word cause in your essay if you can avoid it. It may be related. There can be a tendency to suggest. Some may have associated this. All those sorts of sentences are fine. But once you start saying, well, dyslexia is caused by a timing deficit, well, you've got a lot of arguments to make. Okay, so there are some biological theories that have been summarized quite nicely in work by Beaton. They include theories such as the phonological delay deficit theory as a cause of dyslexia, the temporal time processing problem, might be cerebellar, visual problems. So I'd like to recommend this book, John Morton's Understanding Developmental Disorders. He has spent many years thinking about the development of neurocognitive circuitry. He thinks about it as a cognitive neuroscience would in terms of brain, mind, and behavior. I do keep banging on about that. In your essays, you're going to be talking about particular brain regions, and you're going to be saying those brain regions are very important for, I don't know, whatever it is you're interested in, memory, stress, reading, maths. But in order to make the case, you're going to have to talk about the cognitive processes that are supposed to be linking the brain with those types of behavior. So today we've talked about Broca's area as being important for holding those articulation codes. Well, Broca's area is a region of the brain. We think it's something to do with language, but when we will talk about it intelligently, we have to start introducing these cognitive concepts such as articulation codes, which are the instructions for producing a particular type of sound with your mouth, with your biology. So those sorts of, that is a cognitive concept. You can't see articulation codes, right? They're part of this theoretical thing in the middle of our sandwich between brain and behavior. But unless you talk about articulation codes, these invisible cognitive concepts, actually just saying Broca's area is important for language because when somebody fell off their motorbike and damaged it, they couldn't talk anymore. That's as far as you can go, really, with that. Yeah. So you need to have, if you're going to take a sensible approach, you need the cognitive neuroscience approach with mind in the middle. The only thing I would say about it is, the only slight criticism of the cognitive neuroscience approach is that they do tend to emphasize this direction, particularly in terms of development. That you have your brain and that's producing your mental concepts, and those mental concepts get translated into behavior. And we know from an educational point of view that it actually goes back the other way quite strongly. So particularly true with language, nobody is going to learn a language, well, nobody's going to learn to read unless you actually modify their behaviors in some way. So as a teacher, you're going to say, you're learning to read, you're going to be looking, I want you to look at this book, isn't it interesting? Whatever, you engage their attention, you modify their behavior. They would never normally be having that behavior if the teacher wasn't taking control. That is introducing things into their mind, which ultimately is going to actually completely rewire their brain. And it will rewire their brain. So for example, this part of the brain here, that I talked about as the visual word form area, well, we talk about it as the visual word form area, but actually, if you look at a study, as they did, of people who've never learnt to read. They found this sample of Portuguese peasants who've never learnt to read, and they found that this part of the brain they were using to be sensitive at identifying objects, pictures, but also in terms of social face-to-face recognition. And as they learnt to read, so that part of the brain started becoming more and more sensitive to print and words that were put in front of them. You put a word in front of this Portuguese peasant who's now had 6 weeks of reading, suddenly it starts activating the visual word form area. Great. But interestingly, it starts becoming less sensitive to all those other things that that person was using it for. And, you know, in terms of if you take this zero-sum idea, that there is some sort of competition going on in the cortex, I would love to know, and I have a colleague in Shanghai who is doing this at the moment with looking at this very same issue. And it seems likely that actually they are going to become less able to recognize faces, and perhaps in some areas less skilled as a result of learning to read. So learning to read really does rewire the brain, and it doesn't come about unless you modify people's behaviors, because they wouldn't normally do it if they were, you know, a few thousand years ago. In fact, still only a small proportion of the globe's population can read. So, you know, cognitive neuroscience is not just about going from brain, mind and behavior. As educators, we're particularly interested in modifying behaviors to influence minds and eventually reconstruct brains. Okay, but nevertheless, this tends to be the way that developmental cognitive neuroscientists do it. They tend to have the arrows going down like this. So I'm going to go with the Morton approach at the moment. Let's put the environment here. Saying that, you know, for example, you know, English orthography, the fact that they're living in England or America, that's going to really influence the uptake of their reading abilities, the increase in their reading abilities. So this is one theory. This is model one, the phonological delay deficit model. What we say is that we've got 3 levels: brain, mind, behavior. Mind is the same as cognition. Okay. We start off with a genetic difference. Well, dyslexia is to some extent inherited. Okay, so we know there are genes involved, but we also know that the environment has a massive effect on it as well. Genetics, genes will give rise to proteins that will give rise to brain structures. So maybe we end up with a brain difference. Maybe dyslexic children start off with a fundamental difference in their brain, or maybe not, actually. I'm not sure about that. But let's just say that is what happens. And that gives rise to a phonological processing deficit. What does that mean? Well, one of the things it means is that they can't hear so well the difference between 2 speech sounds. Okay, and that's difficult to measure in infants, but it has been done using EEG by playing different speech-like sounds to newborn infants and showing that if the speech sound is different, some children produce an electrical response above the head due to neural activity, and some children don't. And the children who don't actually are more likely to develop dyslexia. And that's at newborn, that's at birth. Okay, so it's quite an impressive piece of evidence to suggest that maybe there is some genetic brain difference that gives rise to this phonological processing deficit. Now, if that's the case, then these children are going to have trouble mapping sounds to orthography that they see on the page, the spellings they see on the page, because they can't tell the difference so well between the speech sounds. So that means that they are going to have problem with their mapping the graphemes to the phonemes. That should say not learned. I apologize for that. Okay, so the grapheme phoneme system is not learned, so there's a problem. And then that means they're going to have difficulty learning to read. And if that's the case, and this is the central problem, then we would expect to see language differences, and that people who are in England suffering from this a lot more than people who live in Italy. And we do see that. But we can go further than that and say, hang on, if they've got a phonological processing deficit, actually it's not just going to be the reading, we're going to be able to see this in different ways. So for example, phonological tasks are going to be difficult because they're not going to be able to hear the difference between words that rhyme. So a rhyming task is going to be difficult for children more difficult for children who have dyslexia. We do see evidence for that. They're going to have troubles with naming because they're not going to be able to tell the difference actually, in terms of speech sounds. So even verbally naming something without anything to do with writing is going to become more difficult because they can't hear the difference between two auditory representations of a name. And also they're going to find spoonerisms particularly difficult. So if they are reading a sentence such as, "You have hissed all my mystery lectures and tasted a whole worm," they're going to have real difficulty with that because they're not able to actually decode each word out of the semantics so easily, because that's what you would do in that case, because you're now relieved. What you expect to see on there in terms of visual memory is not there, so you can't rely back on your visual memory strategy. You actually have to decode each word separately without any semantic cues, and because you're less able to do that, then there's going to be more problems. So all of that tends to hang together. So the phonological deficit model does make sense. I'm not sure whether it's a complete model, because it's possible that phonological decoding could arise from different ways. So we still haven't, we might say, okay, it's phonological decoding, that's the problem, but we don't know what causes the phonological decoding. Okay, we don't know what causes that problem, but it seems to make sense in many respects. Let's take another model, the temporal processing model. So this is an idea that's been put forward by Paula Talal, apart from amongst other people. Maybe there is a problem in the magnocellular system. Maybe it's in the auditory system, which is actually causing slower temporal processing or visual temporal processing. But let's say it's in both here. So we've got an auditory deficit and a visual deficit. Well, the auditory deficit is certainly going to give rise to phonological processing problems. Again, we'll get the grapheme phoneme system not learned, and we'll see all those things that are associated with that, which we've seen on the previous slide. But additionally, we're going to see other issues with this auditory deficit. So we're going to see poor speech development amongst dyslexic readers if it is a temporal processing problem. But actually, we often don't. We can do, but there are many people who have problems with reading who don't have problems with speech development. We also would see poor tone discrimination, being able to tell the difference between two tones, because that relies on the magnocellular system as well, but we don't tend to see that. We would see poor motion detection, because that's also a timing problem. We'd also see a visual deficit giving rise to poor motion detection in terms of visual stimuli, but we don't tend to see that. So when you start mapping it out in this way, you can start seeing that if you think about things in a broader sense and you don't just jump to conclusions, you can usually find quite critical arguments against some of these proposed theories of dyslexia. Skill automation is another suggested theory for dyslexia. The idea here is that you just have trouble making things automatic. Okay, remember when we were looking at maths, I said you learn it consciously, you step through it in your working memory, and then after a while it becomes automatic and it moves from frontal regions to posterior regions. Well, maybe dyslexic readers have problems in making things automatic. Well, let's say that, that points to a cerebellar problem, because the cerebellum is very much related to automatic motor responses. We would definitely see problems in speech motor areas, and yes, this would give rise to poor skill automation, and you can see how that would cause problems with the grapheme phoneme system not being automatically learnt. So we get all the same issues here, but we would also see problems with balance if you've got that cerebellar issue. We can see it. We can see it in some people with dyslexia. There is that comorbidity. Comorbidity means the occurrence of more than one developmental disorder or set of problems. But we see many dyslexics who do not have balance problems. Again, with time estimation, if you have problems with those sorts of timing, but we don't see that generally with people with dyslexia. And actually, if it was a cerebellar problem, then you would also see problems with fine manual dexterity, being able to carry out fine motor tasks. Some people with dyslexia have it, most do not. Yes. Well, yes. And I think we have to go back to the neuroconstructivist idea, you know, that a problem in one area of the brain can actually bring about different developmental outcomes. So, when you're looking at a brain as something which is under construction, and this idea of dynamics and things moving forward and one thing knocking onto another, then you can clearly see how, you could actually end up using this model with somebody with dyspraxia, or somebody, you know, with problems with their motor coordination, and also somebody who also suffers from dyslexia. So you could actually, this model might make sense for some types of learner, actually, who have those multiple problems. And maybe model 1 also occurs for people who don't have those additional problems. You know, maybe we shouldn't be looking for one model to explain everything that's happening with everybody, which is really what the neuroconstructivist argument is saying. Visual damage. Okay, so this has been put forward by Stein, John Stein, who I believe is related to Ricky Stein, is that right? The fish person? Maybe I got that wrong. I think it's his brother. He suggested that there may be specific damage to the visual system. I mean, again, you would see visual performance problems, but of course, you know, if that was the case, you would also see no phonological processing problems. You would in terms of language, but because you've got a problem with the visual system in terms of reading. But when phonological processing is measured using things that are purely auditory, you should not see any issues arising. And yet, you know, actually, we do tend to see in large numbers of cases of people with dyslexia links to those types of phonological processing issues. So I suppose what I'm trying to convince you of is that cause is tricky, and we will be talking about cause, about how to talk about cause really in a workshop, which is much more about how you articulate things in your essays. But from the science, I think you can begin to understand the complexity of this, and you can't just jump to conclusions. Just the fact that you've got a brain difference, or even a behavioural difference in one particular aspect, it really doesn't lead to a very straightforward conclusion about cause. But the other thing I wanted to convince you of is the importance of thinking about things in terms of the brain, the mind, and behaviour, and how well that actually provides a framework for thinking about cause and many other things. Does any of this knowledge have implications for education? I haven't used my figures yet, have I? Yes, I'm about to. That's good. Well, possibly it does. Maybe I should change that to yes, given that the Wellcome and the EEF have just given £4 million out to implement these ideas in the classroom. Well, I hope so. We will see. A number of interventions have been developed which map, for example, which attend to this idea of phonological processing, you know, based on the neuroscience evidence. And once you develop an intervention based on a neuroscientific theory, then it should be possible to study the effects of an intervention, using techniques such as fMRI. So if you're saying, look, these brain activities are causing the problem, we have an intervention for that, then you should see an effect on the brain activities when you implement the intervention. So a number of interventions have been developed which map onto the neurological evidence related to reading and reading disorders. One of them is fast forward. I have to be careful here because I'm broadcasting this and I do not want to be litigated against by American companies, very litigational. So this was an intervention aimed at remediating impairments in the temporal processing system. The idea is that you've got these temporal processing deficits, which can, some evidence for that has been found, and therefore it's a matter of practicing again and again using this software, which adapts to individual skill levels and responses, and It develops memory, attention, processing and sequencing, the underlying cognitive processes for those which are supposed to be supporting reading and learning. It says the learning techniques are based on decades of neuroscience research. Well, maybe. And it claims to get results in as little as 3 to 6 weeks. That's 30 minutes each day, 5 days a week for 3 to 6 weeks. Does it work? Well, a neuroimaging study found evidence for both the behavioral and the neural remediation. So it found that there were increases in activation in these areas amongst the children who improved as a result of the fast forward intervention. So that's quite nice to be able to, see deactivations related to dyslexia and then see those areas increase their activation as a result of the intervention, and also improvements in reading that are associated with that. However, I have to say that after a lot of initial enthusiasm, some negative reviews are coming through about this. Borman 2009 reviewed many studies doing a meta-analysis and concluded that there was not as much evidence as you might think for effectiveness of this intervention. But of course, that's just my opinion, he said to the camera. Other interventions have also remediated reading and brain activity. Phonological targeted training. Actually, this is becoming, there's quite a few studies that have looked at phonological training. And again, you see, the Shaywitz study is particularly well known. And again, you see changes in the brain function and changes in the behavior in terms of reading. And that's helpful, not just in terms of knowing the intervention is working, but also in terms of understanding that those areas of the brain must be quite important for reading. So yes, in the Eden study, the trained group showed improvements at the behavioural level, plus increases in task-related brain activity, particularly in the left hemisphere parietal cortex and some right hemisphere regions. But, we're talking about, do we always have to see increases in activity that are related to improved learning? No, we don't. No, because actually, when you're learning complex mathematics, you see an increase in areas associated with automaticity. But remember, we saw decreases in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as people got better and better at it, and they needed less and less working memory. So don't get into this idea that good interventions always increase brain activity. Actually, sometimes they decrease brain activity. And I have to share with you, I don't know if there's anybody in here who participated in it, but we've been looking at the effects of gaming and learning through gaming. And we did this big fMRI study last year. And one of the big result I think we're going to get from it, I'll switch this off actually. Yeah. Okay, so will brain imaging become part of technology design? I hope so. Graphagame is a non-commercial system developed at the university in Finland. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. Actually, Graphagame is one of the studies that's being rolled out by the Wellcome and the EEF to thousands of school children. It's one of the new neuroscience and education interventions. This introduces association of graphemes and phonemes according to frequency and consistency of grapheme in a given language. So it says this, okay, this is your language, this is your ability, and we're going to keep presenting phonemes, and you have to tell us, what they correspond to in terms of the spelling. So it's improving that grapheme phoneme mapping, and it's adaptive. So it actually adapts what it's presenting in response to the way in which the person's learning is progressing. And Brem et al. Oh, sorry, I should have said, by the way, when we're looking at that Paula Talal study, the previous study, I have actually shown the activations on here. And you can see the children with no remediation, there are areas where the dyslexic children increase those classic, see those left hemisphere regions here, dyslexic children increasing those classic reading areas in the left hemisphere after remediation. And possibly those right hemispheres may be something to do with those right hemisphere activations, maybe something to do with visual learning strategies, don't know. But certainly the language areas in the left hemisphere, classic ones, increasing their activity as a result of remediation. Now also on here, figure 2, I've put the Brem results, because this is another type of reading intervention, and this is based on the grapher game, where you're just improving that mapping of phonemes to orthographic representation, to the spelling, to the visual representation. And I thought it might be quite good, actually, to look at this, because you're going to be looking at illustrations like this. And I'd like you to sort of, I'm just going to ask you to spend 5 minutes looking at both of these diagrams, and then I'm going to ask you a few questions about them. Okay. Because I think you're going to come across pictures like this, and I've actually just reproduced the legends as they are in the neuroscience journals. And you're going to have to make sense of these. So I'd like you to have a little look at them first, and then we'll discuss them. All right. So these are 2 interventions, one from the fast forward, which we discussed, and one for the grapher game intervention. And these are the pictures that were provided in the neuroscience articles with the legends. Read the legend for 2 minutes, and we'll have a quick discussion about it. Okay. So if you look at figure 1, we've got neural effects of remediation in children with developmental dyslexia. A, left hemisphere activations of control children and children with dyslexia are shown during rhyming. So first of all, why are we doing rhyming? Why are they doing rhyming? Because it links with spelling. Yeah. Why are we particularly interested in rhyming amongst children with dyslexia? Okay. Yeah, try. Okay, yeah. So rhyming is linked to phonological decoding, and we think that phonological decoding is a significant issue with children with dyslexia. It's an early marker. So whether or not you think it's the cause, most people would agree that it's an issue. So left hemisphere activations. Why are we looking at the left hemisphere in particular? Yeah, so that's where we think most of the language centres are in most children. Yeah, although it's a good point that they might not all the children. That might not be true for all the children in this study. Are shown during rhyming as compared with matching. So why are they comparing it with matching?
Because there might not be an issue with matching, or it's quite emphasised that there'd be less of an issue with matching.
Right. Okay, yeah, because matching is basically just a control condition, isn't it, really? Because matching doesn't require any any phonological processing. So there's going to be lots of things that are going on with these children when they look or when they hear a rhyme or they see a rhyme, they say these two words rhyme. They're going to actually have to, or if they hear the two words, I'm not sure whether they heard them or whether they saw them, but there's going to be all sorts of processing which is not necessarily to do with phonological processing. Just the fact there's a new stimuli has suddenly been presented, the novelty of that will stimulate some midbrain areas, I expect. So we have to compare it with another condition which has got everything that we want except the thing we're it's got all the same things except the aspect we're interested in. So matching and rhyming tasks, they're both completely identical. All the processes should be exactly the same, in terms of that novel stimulus and having to respond and pressing a button or whatever, except the fact that one requires phonological decoding. What's this P.025? What's that all about? Probability. Yeah, somebody's been to the statistic little workshops. This is good. So it's something to do with probability. So P equals 0.025 actually means, yes? Yeah, probability of happening by chance. So we're only looking at activations where there's less than a 2.5% chance they could be by chance, essentially. Actually, that's a very liberal threshold, and I imagine it must be corrected massively in some way, because you'll see in the next one that they use 0.001, which is much closer to the norm. And they've also said 20 voxel threshold. You know what? I mean, there's no reason why you should know this because we've never discussed it, but it's a good thing to talk about. Now, what is a voxel? Because you'll see people referring to voxels in these papers.
Isn't it like just an activated sort of 3D area or something?
Yeah, basically it is. You have pixels on the TV, two-dimensional pixels. Well, in the brain scan, we talk about three-dimensional voxels. Okay, so the brain, they divide them up into lots and lots of little 3 millimeter by 3 millimeter by 3 millimeter boxes. Okay, little cubes, and each one of those is called a voxel. And they're saying that unless there's at least 20 of these active that are touching each other, so we've got a cluster, we're not going to show it. Okay, so all the little peaks that might just be random, they've got rid of. Now, if we look at that diagram, what are we supposed to be looking at that's interesting? What's the difference between those two pictures in A? What's the interesting thing? Yeah, okay, so anybody else want to articulate that one? I should be asking for hands up, shouldn't I really? To get back to my teacher mode, yes.
In the dyslexic children, the areas aren't highlighted, as in the
Yeah, so what should I be looking at here? So there's these two circles, isn't there? Right, and the difference between the top one and the bottom one is there a reduction or an increase? A reduction, isn't there? Yeah, so we can see that. I know it's not very easy, this, because it's not in colour, which does produce some problems, but you can see that there is some grey activity in the top picture and it's disappeared in the bottom picture. So they're saying that activity you see in normal children, in inverted commas, when they are rhyming rather than just matching, has disappeared amongst dyslexics. We don't see those that additional activity. So activity related to phonological decoding seems to be very reduced amongst the dyslexics. And then in B, we're looking at brain areas that showed increased activity during phonological processing in the dyslexic group after remediation. So they did the training exercise, then they did the rhyming task again, and we are supposed to see, I think, areas and in those two circles that have increased their activation. You can very, very vaguely see in this bad quality photocopy that there are some there's some grey areas, there's a little grey splodge, particularly on the left-hand circle, I think, which is basically just part of the brain, just the activity where there's been increase of the dyslexics relative to before. Okay, so it's the before-after increase for the dyslexic children. Are any other questions about that? So figure 2, we're now looking at the graphogame intervention. I do like these types of study because they really demonstrate the plasticity of the brain, because this is, these are lessons. This is the way in which the function of the brain changes as a result of some sort of educational training. And they're looking at emerging print sensitivity seen as differential fMRI activation to words and false fonts and projected onto a pediatric brain template. Wow. Okay, so I have to translate that into English. So what we're saying is that we are seeing the sensitivity to print as represented by brain function on using fMRI, which stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. Very good. And they're looking at the difference between words and false fonts. Why false fonts was like the nonsense letters, the nonsense symbols, should I say, not letters. Why are we doing that? It's the control condition, yeah? So looking at the false fonts, the symbols that don't really exist in the world in terms of language, does all the things that you do when you're reading, because you're looking at a visual stimulus, you're pressing a button or whatever because you have to respond in the scanner, but you're not doing the reading bit. So you're only now looking at the brain activity related to that reading bit. On a pediatric brain template left, which means just like some model of the brain really, on 3 sections, K greater than 0. Okay, so I'll have to tell you because you wouldn't know, but K there is the threshold. So they're actually saying that they're showing all the active voxels now. They're not just showing the ones that are clustered in clusters of 20 or more together. They're actually showing all of them. They're showing fMRI activation to words and false fonts for the whole fMRI sample. So this was that's the whole sample. Where I've lost my place now, sorry. On the before and the after training using graphogame, and you can see that there is an increase in activity, particularly in the left and the right hemisphere, by those 2 grey blobs, which shows where graphogame training has increased brain activity. And I think in the left blob, that looks a little bit like Broca's area, which is where we hold our articulatory code, so that's important. For both conditions, pre and post training was predominantly bilateral occipital temporal. Bilateral means both sides. Occipital temporal means between the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. And of course, that's close to the Wernicke's area. Note that no difference was detected for words versus font stimuli between the two preconditions. So they're just saying that to show that it's valid what they're doing, because you wouldn't expect it to be. And then in B, they're showing an interaction. This is really just another analysis, another way of analyzing a data to show where training increased brain activity. But you will need to go to the original diagram, I think, for that one, because I can't see the activity, I don't think. But I would recommend that you do go to the original diagram. So these things take a little bit of time to decode. You can see the probability threshold here is 0.0001, so they're actually using a much harsher level of statistical significance, I suppose. But we're not told whether it's corrected. Are we told whether it's corrected or not? I think we are. And also, you can see these Zs. Those Zs refer to the Z coordinate. So that's something else which I probably should tell you. That we talked about finding a way about the brain in terms of dorsal, ventral, superior, inferior, frontal, and etc. But actually, another way of doing it is through coordinates, X, Y, and Z. And the X coordinate is whether you're left or right. The Y coordinate is how far forward or back you are. And the Z coordinate is how superior or inferior you are. So when they're saying Z 15, 10, 30, you can see those are transverse sections at different levels in the brain, essentially. Okay, so it looks from those pictures that the training, computer-based training, can actually improve both the, well, we can't see it from the pictures, but we're told it improves the behavioral outcomes, and from the pictures we can see that it actually improves the brain function as well associated with those behavioral functions. So that's important. To summarize the Brem paper, practice with the game initiates print-sensitive activation in a critical component of the mature reading network located in the left occipitotemporal cortex, visual word form area is sometimes called. And what they're saying really is that, this has been useful for showing the intervention works and understanding how the intervention works. But they're also saying it's told us something about reading acquisition, because if this is activated very early on, then it obviously has a very fundamental role in terms of print sound mapping, in terms of, because they've seen it in adult reading, but this is a study that's shown it's activating very early on, in the very first stages of doing your reading exercises. And such results provide insight into how the software works, but it also suggests how neuroscience might be used to develop these types of intervention, because if that's the neural marker that we're interested in, then maybe version 2 of this software can be produced with a greater emphasis on those aspects of reading, and maybe we should expect to see increased changes in the brain as a result of that version 2. And we can use the neuroimaging as part of the design process for the technology. That's an exciting possibility for the future. Now, I shouldn't leave you without saying that obviously there are all sorts of arguments about dyslexia, and just a couple of years ago we had Julian Elliott here, who really got us asking some difficult questions about whether dyslexia and some of these other developmental disorders exist in the way that the public at least perceives that they exist, and are they useful labels anyway? He asked these sorts of questions. Is dyslexia a clinically or educationally meaningful term for differentiating between children with reading difficulties? Because one of the things we've seen in these interventions, and if you read those papers, you'll pick up a sense in how interventions that work with children with dyslexia, both in terms of behavior and brain function, also seem to work for children without dyslexia. So it's not as if we've found some sort of dyslexia-specific cure, because actually this is just good reading practice. This is what dyslexics benefit most from. Standard, conventional reading practice. And he also asked, to what extent would the dyslexic diagnosis guide the educator in devising appropriate forms of intervention? Well, you know, if what we're understanding about the dyslexic brain is the sense, it in no way separates it from any other type of reading brain, that really we're all just on this continuum, and that reading interventions that are good for dyslexics are good for people without dyslexia, how is this diagnosis actually useful in terms of guiding what people should do for children diagnosed with dyslexia? To what extent should the dyslexic diagnosis result in the differential allocation of resources or other forms of special arrangement? So at the moment, if you have a diagnosis of dyslexia, you get special treatment and resources are made available to you. If we are saying that dyslexia is just about being bad at reading, is that fair? Because there are going to be children without a diagnosis of dyslexia who are bad at reading, just as bad at reading, who will not be receiving this special allocation. Now, I don't want to answer those questions. We can't really get into this argument. I can see people going like this already. But these are issues that we will pick up in issues in neuroscience and education. Suffice to say for the moment that from the neuroscience and also from the genetics, actually, there is no evidence suggesting there's a qualitative difference between the way in which the dyslexic brain reads and the non-dyslexic brain reads. And it does seem to be the case that the label of dyslexia is a socially constructed idea, but there are many socially constructed ideas like justice that are very worthwhile and worthy. What we have to do is to discuss and argue whether the label of dyslexia is worthy. Okay, are there any final questions? Because I'm seeing quite a few of you again in about half an hour, I think at 2 o'clock. The workshop is in 4:06. Okay, the workshop is in 4:06. Can you put your hand up if you're coming to the workshop so I know? Oh, right. Okay. Okay. Oh well, then that's going to be cosy up there. I've been told it can seat 65, but we'll find out, I think. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll see you in a little while. Yeah. X, Y, and Z. So that's the brain. That is the X. Sorry, what is it? Oh. I'm not resourced sufficiently to be able to answer the question. Oh, hang on, there's one here. Rail dry one. This one might work. This one works. This one works. Okay. So that's Y, that's X, and that's Z. So were you after me? Somebody else? Is it? Yeah.
I was wondering if I were to write something about the phantom limb and everything, is that too
The what? The phantom limb? No, that's all right. Yeah.
Because that's really interesting.
Yes.
Like,
I mean, I would.
And how? Because I was finding articles on it, like how the brain actually then changes back and rewires to adapt to things.
Yeah. I think I'd be all right. I think it's about the plasticity of the motor cortex. And if you call it the plasticity of the motor cortex, something like that would probably be good. Yeah. Okay. US